And so, with her rampage finally over, Mora was then invited by the two other peers to come back and introduce herself to the others. And once on top of this mountain home, the peers, after discussing it, realized that they could each combine their colors and in turn create more of their own. And so the next peer to be made would be Ange, the peer of greed and the color orange. And following behind would be Ro, the peer of earth and rock and the color brown. And so, with all combinations explored, these new guys were brought into the world and introduced to Orion. After meeting the new peers, Orion was very fascinated, as he hadn't even considered or thought possible that his own creations could fuse their colors and create more of their own. Wanting to see everything that was possible, Orion would decide to create two new peers. However, unlike the last four he had created, these two would be pulled from the very essence of him himself. And so Orion created Kuro. He was the peer of death as well as the color black. Following behind would be Shiro. She was the peer of life and the color white. And so, having created two new peers, Orion sat back. And as he sat in his throne, he wondered if the peers that he created could create more just by fusing their colors. He too could do the same. And so, using the remnants of black and white, he would create one more peer. And so Orion would create Gure. She was the peer of grief and the color gray. And so, with their creation, the three new peers flew off to find their other brethren. And so they flew to the mountain where the peers had made their home and introduced themselves, as well as meet all the other new peers that had joined the ranks. It was also with the addition of these new peers with their new colors that they realized they had even more possibilities. And so, very quickly, they took off again to create more. And so the first to fuse their colors would be Raj and Shiro as they took off, ready to combine. This new peer was Rosa. She was the peer of love and the color pink. Rosa would take traits from both her predecessors, just as the other peers had. In Shiro's case, Rosa would represent the love for all life, as there are many different forms of love. One can feel great love for their children, for their spouse, and even their pets. And taking it from Raj, love has the tendency to change. It can either be a very strong, bristling fire, or a very weak and crackling ember. And so following this, Ro would then find Shiro and the two would then create their new fusion. Leaving a Sahara in the wake of his creation, the next peer would be Tanjiro, who was the peer of sand and the color tan. And so, back up top the mountain home, one last color fusion remained. And so it began. And so Clea would be created. She was the peer of tranquility and the color clear. And so this is how things would remain for centuries to come. And as they passed, the peers would watch humanity grow and flourish. They would watch the rise of kings and the fall of empires. It was during these long passes of time that the peers would observe the human families and grow very interested in the idea of children. Being immortal, they knew not the joys of growing up, nor the joys of having children and watching them grow up. And so it was over these long passes of time that the peers would act on this loneliness and father children of their own. And so the peers would have many children. They would be called partials, as they were half human, half peer. Because of this, their hair often took the same color as that of their parents, and these were their children. Raj would go on to father 3 children. The first would be Scarlet. She was the partial of the hearth and the home. The second child would be Day. He was the partial of the daytime, as well as representing the sun as it passed through the sky. And lastly was his son Merlot. He was the partial of embers and fireplaces. Following behind, Ange would only have 2 children. Her first would be Apricot. He was the partial of war and conquest. And her second would be Marigold, who was the partial of wealth and money. As will soon be apparent, many of the partials take a lot of traits from their parents, be it their element or what they represent. In Angie's case, being the peer of greed, her children have traits that relate to it, as Marigold is a partial who seeks only wealth, and Apricot as well, as war is really just a means to an end to acquire more wealth. In Amar's case, being the peer of wind and air, it stands to reason and is unsurprising that he had many, many wives, as well as fathering many children. His oldest and most favored one would be Daffodil. She was the partial of music and dancing, and often inspired many humans to pursue different arts. Following behind would be the twins, Dawn and Dusk, who herald the beginning and end of each day, alongside Day and their other cousin Night. The next child would be Dandelion, who represented the north wind, as well as the cardinal direction itself, alongside Dajan, who is the partial of the east wind and the east cardinal direction. Following behind would be Tuscan, who is the partial of the south wind and the south cardinal direction. On top of this, he was also known as the partial with the longest hair, which he often boasted about. Next was Canary, who was the partial of the west wind and the west cardinal direction. And the youngest of the bunch would be Flaxen, who was the partial of tornadoes. Following behind, Ren would also have her own children. Her oldest would be Chartreuse, who is the partial of trees in the forest. Her next child to follow would be Sage, who is the partial of mosses. Next in line would be Fern, who, as his name suggests, was the partial of ferns. The next two would be the twins Basil and Juniper. Basil was the partial of herbs, and also was given the secondary title of partial of food by the humans. His twin sister Juniper was the partial of flowers, and in reality, the two are not twins. Rather, they were born merely on the same day, but to different mothers. However, the two still don't mind being called twins and keep it up centuries later. And the youngest sibling born would be Clover, who was the partial of good luck, and she was often loved by everyone. Taking a page out of Amar's book, Lou went on to have just as many children as he had. Her oldest born would be Night, who was the partial of nighttime, and worked alongside his cousins in order to bring about the cycle of each new day. Her next oldest would be Lapis, who was the partial of rain, and was often a lifesaver to many farmers at the time. Working alongside Lapis would be her sister Teal, who was the partial of clouds, and together the two coordinated where the rain would fall. Cobalt would be the next child to follow, and she was the partial of the oceans and the seas. Next was Sapphire, who was often regarded by many to be the most timid and shrewish partial of them all. This may correlate to her being the partial of snow. Likewise, her brother Zephyr was the partial of ice, and he was often regarded as one of the most coldest and calculating partials of them all. The most aloof and the youngest was Cyan, who was the partial of mist, and was often found in the most randomest areas, doing the most randomest things. Mora will also go on to have children as well, and many of their personalities were very striking to say the least. The oldest was Iris, who was the partial of joy, and this may be related to the fact that her mother was the pure of electricity. The middle child would be Sangria, who was the partial of storms, and to say she was a hothead wouldn't be far from the truth. And the youngest was Lilac, who was the partial of discord, and often created or found problems wherever she could. Following next would be a very peculiar situation, as Rosa was the only peer to meet, fall in love with, marry, and have only 3 children with one human man. And after his passing, Rosa swore to never take another husband, and has kept that promise ever since. Their oldest would be Fuchsia, who was the partial of passion, and no doubt the same passion that the two had for each other. Their next child, Magenta, was the partial of intimacy, and the love shared between 2 people. And their youngest was Taffy, who was the partial of commitment that a man and woman shared together. And these 3 represented the 3 components that made up love, and in turn represented their mother. The next pure to have children would be Ro, who fathered Carob, who was the partial of mountains and canyons. And his youngest, Umber, who was the partial of pottery, and often regarded as one of the most creative partials. And seemingly following a pattern, the neutral color gods all only fathered 2 children. Tanjiro was much the same. His oldest, Fawn, was the partial of the beaches found all around the world. And his younger sister, Sepia, was the partial of all the deserts found around the world, known and unknown. Kuro would also father 2 children, his oldest being Sable, who was actually the partial of misfortune and the opposite of Clover. And his youngest child, Obsidian, was the partial of souls and had the ability to guide them into the afterlife. Surprisingly enough, being one of the most timid gods, Gurei would actually have 2 children. Her oldest would be Anchor, who was the partial of despair. As stated before, this may be due to the fact that Gurei herself was the pure of grief, and often the children took many traits from their parents. In a similar vein, Gurei would have another child, and he was the partial of guilt. Likewise, Shiro would only have 2 children. Her oldest would be Chiffon, who was the partial of vitality. She shared this trait with her brother Alabaster, as he was the partial of healing. And lastly, Clea would have children of her own as well. However, very uniquely, she is the only pure to have only 1 child, this being Opaque. Being the partial of apathy, it was very hard for her to relate to the other partials, and even the humans that prayed to her. It was during this time, with the creation of all these new pures and partials, that the humans and the pures would bring about a golden age. However, this wouldn't be to last. However, what would come from that glowing dot in the night sky is a story for another day. Also, big shout out to my coworker Lindsay, who drew up this very nice piece of daffodil when we were super bored at work.